So one of the things that I've also come to realize is that as a profession, we went from very little conversation about anti-Semitism, about Jewish college students. And then all of the sudden, we're seeing it dominating the news. We're seeing it dominating, different college campuses. We've gone from almost zero-ish to 100-ish very quickly.
Right,
And
right.
these conversations, have been emotionally charged, politically charged. We've been venturing into really thorny issues around free speech, legal issues, and the temperature's high, right?
Mhm.
And so what I would hope for us to be able to talk about is just really understanding who are Jewish college students,
Right.
right? What is the identity of Jewish college students?
Welcome to Student Affairs Now, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I'm your host, Rochelle Pope. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a professor in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program at the University at Buffalo, and I serve as a Senior Associate Dean for Faculty and Student Affairs and the Chief Diversity Officer for the Graduate School of Education. I'm recording today near the University of Buffalo's campus on the unceded land of the Haudenosaunee people. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and online learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays. Find details about this episode or browse our archives at studentaffairsnow.com. Today, we're discussing the identities and experiences of Jewish students on campus. Many Jewish students have reported feeling unsafe and traumatized amidst the rise of anti-Semitism on campus, in our nations, and across the globe. In a moment, I'll introduce our guest. The deeply thoughtful Elisa Abes, joining me today to talk about the identities and experience of Jewish students and the findings from a study she recently conducted. But before I do that, I need to give thanks to those who make these free webcasts possible. Today's episode is sponsored by Huron, a global professional services firm that collaborates with clients to put possible into practice. We're also sponsored today by Rutledge, Taylor, and Francis. View our complete catalog of authoritative education titles at rutledge.com/education. Stay tuned to the end of the podcast for more information about each sponsor. Now, let's get to today's episode. Elisa, thank you. Thank you for joining me today for us to be able to have this important conversation, and welcome to the podcast. Can you begin by telling us just a little bit about you, your current role on campus, and a bit about your pathway?
Sure, absolutely. First, I want to thank you, Rochelle, for being so inviting and open to having this conversation. I really appreciate it. So again, I'm Elisa Abes. I use she and her pronouns. I am a professor in the Student Affairs and Higher Education program at Miami University, where I also serve as the Graduate Studies Director. Miami is located in Oxford, Ohio, which is the traditional homelands of the Miami and Shawnee people. So I come to this work today because for now over 20 years, almost 25 years, I have been studying and teaching student development theory. And the way that I come to this work is by using critical perspectives. So rather than situating the students, right, as the problems, if they're not developed enough, I think about how the contexts are the problems that need to be fixed, because
Right.
contexts are so shaped by different systems of oppression, such as
Right.
racism, ableism. Starting last year, I wanted to, it became very important to me to also bring anti-Semitism into this conversation, because at that point, we really weren't talking about, as a profession, anti-Semitism as a system of oppression that was shaping the development, the identity of college students.
Mhm.
So I started a research project that I actually proposed back in the summer, so prior to October 7th, to study the identity of Jewish college students in the context of anti-Semitism. And I should also say that, so I identify as Jewish. Being Jewish is a central part of who I am as a person, religiously, culturally, ethnically. And so I feel like I really have a moral imperative to do this work, to talk about this work to talk about this work in our profession. And I'm at a point in my career where I have the privilege to be able to have these really difficult conversations. So I'm really grateful to be able to do this with you today.
You know, that's an interesting point that anti-Semitism has probably been rising on campus. We could probably go back to 2016. It was there was probably some stuff going on before that, but since 2016, and yet we just that you just started thinking, I want to do this study last year. So talk to me about what brought you to this last year, or what could have brought you to this sooner, and why you didn't.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think part of what brought me to it last year was exactly what you said, was that anti-Semitism really has been brewing, well, for centuries,
Century.
but very much since around 2016, 2017, what we are seeing is that white nationalism has just become emboldened, right? We saw that in 2017 with the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where people were chanting, Jews will not replace us, the Tree of Life shooting. The next
Mhm.
year, where 11 people were, killed in the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. We saw that, many other examples. We can fast forward to January 6th, the attack on the Capitol that was also full of anti-Semitic rhetoric, imagery, and to a point where really in 2022, we were seeing an unprecedented number of anti-Semitic incidents being reported.
Mhm.
And so, for me, I was, I've been watching this. I think I felt some it continued to grow. It was
Mhm.
each year we were seeing something new happen. Each year we were seeing college students, more up of an uptick on college campuses. So I think for me, I just reached a point where for personally, I didn't feel like I could be silent anymore.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, it really did. That's why I really feel like it became just a moral obligation on my part. I was at a point in my career, I was at that really was coinciding with this uptake and or uptick. And so that's what just really, that's what really was the impetus behind it. Now, timing's everything, right? So I proposed this study in the summer of
Mhm.
2023, got IRB, the ethics approval to do it on October 9th of
Uh,
2023. So
right.
2 days after the October 7th, attack by Hamas on Israel. And so that then really caused me to really, think about how to do this in the most ethical way, maybe even slow down a drop, as students were
Mhm.
really struggling. But it was just that combination of the rise of anti-Semitism and my realization that I was in a position to start doing this research.
Sure. Well, there's so much that's going on, like what the students are experiencing, what's happening around us and everything. And so I'm wondering if you could um, help our conversation by talking about what do we need to discuss today and why, so that we can have a better understanding of Jewish students and their identity on campus today.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I've also come to realize is that as a profession, we went from very little conversation about anti-Semitism, about Jewish college students. And then all of the sudden we're seeing it dominating the news. We're seeing it dominating, different college campuses. We've gone from almost zero-ish to 100-ish very quickly.
Right,
And
right.
these conversations, have been emotionally charged, politically charged. We've been venturing into really thorny issues around free speech, legal issues. And the temperature's high, right?
Mhm.
And so what I would hope for us to be able to talk about is just really understanding who are Jewish college students,
Right.
right? What is the identity of Jewish college students? Because what I'm noticing is that in these very emotionally charged, politically driven conversations, we're losing some focus just on who the students are.
Right.
And as we know, both know well, is that, college is this time of self-discovery. And so Jewish students are figuring out who they are
Mhm.
in the midst of all of this emotionally charged times. And so what I feel like we really need to talk about is just as student affairs professionals, what do we need to understand about Jewish identity, Jewish experiences, and how to provide support? But having said that, we also need some background knowledge, right, about what is anti-Semitism. It's how does that connect with, or possibly connect, around with anti-Zionism. So there are some concepts we also need to talk about in order to ground our conversation around Jewish identity.
Right. Like when we're talking about student development in any form, it's not in a vacuum. It's going on with what's happening around us. So you mentioned that maybe a place to begin, one place to begin, was to sort of stop and look at anti-Semitism, because that's what the students are experiencing, or many of the students have expressed experiencing. So what does anti-Semitism look like on campus, or why is it so important to understand anti-Semitism? And you also talked about some relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So why don't we just start there? It's
Sure.
such a small question,
I
right?
know, right. So, um, so I think to even understand what's happening on college campuses, we do need to have a broader understanding of anti-Semitism. And you're right, we're going to do this. We're going to have to do this pretty fast, and hopefully it opens up more curiosity for folks to learn more. But starting just with initially what you said, what's happening on college campuses, you know, our Jewish college students have been experiencing, just an exponential rise, as you had mentioned, in anti-Semitic incidents. In fact, since October 7th, there's been a reporting of almost a 300% increase in terms of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States, and and of course, corresponding exponential increase on campuses.
Well,
It's
wait. What's interesting about that is you said a 300% increase
yeah.
since October 7th.
Mhm.
And I had seen figures that in the year before that, there was a 300% increase. So if this is really going quickly.
It is. It really is. Because it was in 2022 that it was one of the highest numbers of anti-Semitic incidents being reported. This is by the Anti-Defamation League since they started tracking in the 1970s. So
Wow.
it was really, yeah, really high rise and then continuing to grow. And Jewish students are experiencing anti-Semitism in a number of different ways. They're experiencing it, through they're seeing a lot of physical, assaults, verbal assaults, vandalism, graffiti, uh, people, students in residence halls not wanting to be roommates, with Jewish college students, uh, just flyers, around campus. And that's even just before we talk about, right, what's happened about some of these more contemporary iterations as well that, are connecting anti-Semitism with what's happening in Israel and Gaza. Um, but I think to even put that into context, if it's okay, I'd
Sure.
like to even take one step backwards, um, and talk a little bit about even what anti-Semitism is. Um, so because anti-Semitism is one of the really oldest hates around. And there's a lot of different definitions
Mhm.
around anti-Semitism. Broadly speaking, we'd say it is a hatred toward Jews. It's the marginalization, oppression, discrimination um, toward Jewish people, Jewish community. I think about anti-Semitism, other folks think about anti-Semitism as kind of falling into three different categories that can help us make some sense of it. One is different anti-Semitic tropes or conspiracy theories. The second one being more of some of these incidents I was just mentioning that fall into more categories that are more hate crime
Mhm.
like. And then this third category of being this considered like this new anti-Semitism, contemporary, that does connect anti-Semitism with what's happening in Israel.
Mhm.
So just real again briefly, some of these anti-Semitic tropes, you know, we often hear, Jews described as being wealthy, greedy, cheap as a trope. Jews as controlling everything, Jews controlling the media, the government, the economy, Jews as these powerful white oppressors.
Mhm.
Lots of conspiracy theories. Typically, when something's going wrong in the United States, in the world,
Right.
it's easy to blame the Jews. Jewish people have been blamed for 9/11, for COVID, for COVID vaccines as being a tool to make money. Jewish people, when there were wildfires in California, Jewish people were blamed by a politician for having, Jewish space lasers, and there's this wonderful book called We Need to Talk About Anti-Semitism by Rabbi Diana Fursko, which came out earlier 2023. And she talks about it very much as a virus. You
Mhm.
know, Jewish people aren't to blame for COVID, but it's like a virus that just keeps reemerging. When something, when something wrong is bad is happening in society, this virus comes to life of anti-Semitism. Holocaust denial, right?
Mhm.
The great replacement theory. That's what was driving, some of the rioters in the Unite the Right rally, which is this conspiracy theory that Jewish people are plotting um, overtake to overtake white people with minorities, right? So it's this replacement theory. Holocaust inversion, when something is when something is troubling to compare it to a death march or when to different acts that a person is like a Nazi, right, which really minimizes the realities of the Holocaust. So these are some of the tropes and the conspiracy theories that I think many people have just been socialized in, into believing, right? Then we have the category of what's more hate crime like, when we have different kinds of assaults and vandalism, swastikas, graffiti. There is this a group, I follow them on Instagram called Jewish on Campus, and
Mhm.
it is younger college age Jewish students who are really serving as a watchdog, right, for different incidents happening. They just reported just yesterday, mezuzah is being a mezuzah, which is a really important Jewish symbol on a lot of Jewish homes, on their doorposts,
Mhm.
being ripped off of the doorpost, right, of a Jewish student. So we're seeing these kinds of incidents. So we've got that category that is more physical, verbal attack like. And then there's this more, what a lot of students are experiencing now, which is this more new anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, which conflates, um, Jewish people with what's happening in Israel. And that's, of course, what a lot of students are struggling with right now.
So, so these students, you said, there's this group of students that are also identifying and cataloging it, and they are experiencing it, and so this whole understanding of what does it mean to be Jewish. I'm just trying to move us to Jewish identity because I'm sure there are students who are Jewish who are at different places in their own development when they experience these events, these um, aggressions and microaggressions on campus and so on. So what is this? What are you learning? What are you finding from the students that you talk to in your study about how they see themselves as Jewish and their Jewish identity?
Yeah. And would it be okay, Rochelle, if I even just preface that a little bit with just an overview of Jewish identity a little bit, just a little
Absolutely.
demographically, because again, I think a lot of folks just don't understand,
Yep.
right, what it means to be Jewish. Jewish people it's like around 2% of the population. So it's a small group and there's just not, I think, yeah, just not a lot of knowledge.
Right.
So even outside of my study, I
Sure.
think it's also just important to point out that, you know, Judaism is it's a religion. And as I mentioned in my introduction, it's also a culture.
Mhm.
It's, it's an ethnicity, and different Jewish students are going to understand or are going to identify differently along, whether they see it as for themselves, a religion, a culture, ethnicity. As a religion, I think it's also just important to recognize too that there's a whole lot of diversity, across what it means to be Jewish as a religion. We talk about there's different, it's not really denominations, but kind of
Yeah.
strands. But like Reform Jewish people, conservative Jewish, which is not a political identity, it's just strand
Right.
of Judaism, conservative Judaism, Orthodox Judaism. And those all have to do with really the extent to which people adhere to very traditional Jewish law,
Mhm.
Jewish traditions. And so I think it's important to recognize that because our students on campus are not all going to look the same
They're
in
not a
terms of,
monolith.
exactly. And yeah, in terms of how they are practicing their need for kosher food or the way they observe the Sabbath, how long they celebrate different holidays. We have Rosh Hashanah coming up, the Jewish New Year. Some students will celebrate that for one day, some students celebrate that for 2 days. And again, it has to do with these different strands and beliefs. And then some students don't even identify that religiously, but
Mhm.
they identify more culturally, ethnically, and some both, right? All three. And, as a culture, it's like any culture, right? We've got shared customs, shared
Mhm.
food, music, dress, language, um, and yeah, celebrations. And there's just common connections that bring us together. And for a lot of Jewish students, that is how they're identifying as Jewish. There was the Pew Research Center did a big study in 2020 of Jewish identity and found that the overwhelming majority of Jewish folks really do identify more culturally and
Mhm.
ethnically Jewish than religiously Jewish. I should also say
Well, that
that,
matches with the society as a whole, right? We are becoming less in the United States, becoming less and less religious.
yeah,
And so it would make sense that in this group as well.
it does. It does. And then, we've got Jews by birth, Jews by choice, folks who've converted. In terms of race, we have Jews who are white. We do have Jews of color. I mean, I think the Pew Research Center was saying about 8% of the Jewish population in the United States are Jews of color, but among college age folks, only 15%. So again, there is a lot of diversity, which matters for, again, who our students are, what they need, the extent to which they're affiliated with Jewish student organizations or not, and the different kinds of support they need. So I just wanted to provide that background
No, I
before
think that's
jumping
important.
into what I was learning through the research.
No, I
Yeah.
think that that's really important to set that as a foundation to help us understand what it is that you were finding. Yeah.
So in terms of my research itself. Um, so just a little background. So it's a qualitative research study, and there's 13. Well, I mean, I'm going to step back a little. Well, no, I'm not going to step back. There's 13. I have a tendency to keep stepping back and wanting to give more context. But so I interviewed 13 Jewish college students at two different campuses over the course of a year. So I interviewed each of them 3 times, and so
Mhm.
a lot of data. Um, the interviews started in November of 2023. So I paused a little bit right after getting IRB approval, talked to some different stakeholders of is this the right time ethically, to come in as a researcher. But so started late fall, did another interview after winter break. Right? Folks have had some time to step back some,
Mhm.
after some of the trauma and whatnot of the fall. And then again over the summer, to just do some wrap up conversations after the school year had ended. The group that I talked to, one thing I'll also say in terms of identity wise, of the 13, 5 of them identify somewhere, are queer identified, would be gender nonconforming, gay, lesbian. So some diversity in that way as well as who I was talking to. And both of the campuses, I should say, are in the Midwest as well. Context really matters in all of this. And that's one thing I want to, I'll talk about some more. Um, One of the things I should even say, though, with context is that one thing we know is that the way anti-Semitism is playing out on different college campuses does matter depending on the particular school, where the
Mhm.
school is located, the population of the school. And that one more context. So my study's a small qualitative study. There was a large quantitative study done by Brandeis University Center for Modern Jewish Studies that looked, at across the United States. And another report that just came out in the last couple of weeks by Professor Eitan Hirsch, who also did more of a national study, both quantitative and some focus groups. And even though it was very interesting because even though my study was a smaller, more pilot study in the Midwest, it was so consistent with larger patterns of what we were seeing across the country, even though, again, the way folks experienced anti-Semitism was different depending on what was happening on their campuses. But one of the things, neither of the campuses where I was doing this research would be considered political activist hotbeds. That's a language came out of the Brandeis study too. Where are our hotspots of anti-Semitism? However, all of the students, the participants in the study, whether they personally experienced anti-Semitism in the sake of whether it be, an assault, vandalism, what they're seeing on social media, which I'd like to talk about a little bit more, they all still felt very much that they are living in a context of anti-Semitism because they are so aware of what is happening nationally.
Mhm.
They are so, whether it be they have friends, at other campuses, or just what they're seeing in the news, but really what they're seeing on social media in particular,
Mhm.
where they're just being bombarded, by anti-Semitism on social media. And so, in fact, one of my participants kept saying, there's always the
Mhm.
what if I feel okay today here at this campus, but, so it was always still within this context of anti-Semitism. What I'm learning so far is that what Jewish college students are experiencing, I'm terming as they're really living in this tension between the joy of being Jewish,
Mm.
the oi of being Jewish, right?
Right,
You got
right.
oi, the oi being, this coming from this Yiddish word, you hear a lot of Jewish folks say the woes, the struggles, the hardship. And I thought I was clever coming up with that myself until I realized, that Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, the U.S. Special Envoy to monitor anti-Semitism in the United States, has written beautifully about the joy and the oi, of being Jewish, and that Jewish people often have to live with this duality and these tensions of what does it mean to be Jewish.
Mhm.
But this was exactly what the students were really wrestling with. They were in such an in-between space. When I talk to Jewish students and just ask what it meant to them to be Jewish, they really talk. It was the joy. It was community. It was connection. It was food and holidays and celebrations. Um, it was this Hebrew word called tikkun olam, which is repairing the world. Gimulah chasadim, another word, acts of loving kindness, mitzvot, doing good deeds and commandments. These were values that a lot of these participants had been raised in, and it was learning, studying, questioning. Because
Mhm.
typically, you say when you ask a Jewish person a question, you get a question back, right? Which I'm sure is what's informed all my teaching. And right. And even though students had different experiences, right? Even among this 13, not a monolith by any stretch, lots of different experiences. And even not all of them even felt connection on campus, but they longed for this connection because that's what it meant to them, right? To be Jewish. Um, Most of the students felt a connection toward Israel, whether they'd, been there, they've spent time there, or they just learned about it, through Hebrew school, religious school. So that was also part of the joy of being Jewish,
Mhm.
but very much community centered, community centered connection. But the oi of being Jewish, the trouble, the hardship really is what was dominating so much of how they were experiencing being Jewish since October 7th.
Mhm.
And I'd like to kind of break down some of what that oi looked like for them. Um, One of the ways that they were struggling was that Jewish identity was becoming a political identity. It was politicized for them.
Mhm.
So what students were explaining was that just to identify as Jewish felt like they were making a political statement. And the reason for this was oftentimes because of anti-Semitism, there became such an binary, unnuanced way of thinking about what it meant to be Jewish.
Mhm.
It's tied in with the Israel-Hamas war. And and so therefore when they would just say I'm Jewish, there was assumptions made about them, about their positions regarding the war, about what their political affiliations were, because we're seeing a lot of that. What these students were talking about too was a feeling that Jewish students were being used, or yeah, Jewish students were being used even as pawns in political conversations. We saw the congressional hearings that were
Yeah.
happening, and which were, there was a lot of political motivation as they would talk, the students talking about there being political motivation behind that. And so what they were reporting again was that felt like they were being lumped into particular political beliefs that they didn't necessarily subscribe to. Because that's another thing I, didn't mention just around Jewish identity, when I was just giving some of that context, was, you know, there's a political spectrum, right, among Jewish identity. There is a larger majority who typically does identify more with liberal beliefs. But again, there's a spectrum, but these students felt like they were being lumped in.
You know,
Yeah.
Elise, let me ask you a question about this because when you
Sure.
first said this, that they were making a political statement. The way I have heard you as you explained it is that people were taking their identity and making a statement from it. Like they were using it to either um, support their assumptions about how you feel because you've said you were Jewish, or but it was external. I'm not making a political statement by saying who I am. You are making my statement of who I am into a political statement. Is that accurate?
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. Because when I think about too the joy, that's more of what's coming internally. The hardship, what they were experiencing was external. It's what it's being imposed on them.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And so, because even one of the participants said, if I just say I'm going to Shabbat or Sabbath dinner, I feel like I need a degree in political science because of what other people are assuming that I am making a political statement by saying I'm Jewish and
Mm-hmm.
affiliate with other Jewish students. So, yeah, so that's a really important clarification. And Jewish students felt like something they had to be an expert again on the war if they said they were Jewish. Because not only did other people assume they had a particular position, which typically was going to mean very pro-Israel and anti-Palestinian, which again is this binary that
Right.
we talk about because that's not how a lot of these students were experiencing their positions. But there's some number of them were saying, I don't even understand what's going on. I'm 18 years old. I just started in school. And so again, it's being politicized by other people and assuming this very firm pro-Israel stance, and that they're experts in it.
Mm-hmm.
And also some folks who served in different kinds of leadership roles in different Jewish organizations as well were feeling that the reason they took on these roles was because of the community and
Right.
wanting to be part of leading this community. And they got thrust into really, needing to be more, feeling a pressure from other folks to be active, to take more activist stands. And some of them, didn't feel comfortable with that. They
Mm-hmm.
didn't feel safe, physically safe, publicly speaking on behalf of Jewish organizations. And one of the things I really noticed over the course of the year in the three interviews was the fatigue. I
Yeah.
mean, by summer, some of these students were exhausted. And again, it was a very difficult year to be in a leadership capacity because of the way other folks were, turning their Jewish identities into this assumption of a political statement.
Right. And you talk about that fatigue. I know that early on when we were considering doing this conversation together, doing this episode, we had the idea of maybe we can get a couple of Jewish students who are experienced to talk, and it's like
Right.
they're so fatigued, we don't need them doing more work
Exactly.
for us, right? And so, we experience that throughout student affairs. We always think, oh, let's get, and we
Yeah,
have to remember that these students are struggling, like I know all during 2020 and beyond, the same thing with Black students. I know that when there were continue to be things going on with LGBTQ students, that we
right.
want to get them in and talk to us to teach us. And it's like, no, we got to do our own work.
Absolutely.
So I can
Absolutely.
imagine the fatigue. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, and that, later as we think about more, how do we support the students? Part of it is, very much on our student affairs professionals to educate, right, to
Right.
do the work. Exactly. Another way that students were experiencing their identities over this past year is, well, as much as their internal understandings were this community, anti-Semitism was doing its best to fracture community and
Mhm.
to cause isolation. And that plays out in a few ways. So one of the ways was what I'm calling this, really intersectional division.
Mhm.
And so as I had mentioned, I had several students, who identified in some way as queer. And what some of these students were finding too was there was no place where they could bring their whole self.
Right.
And so often one of the things that, I was hearing and that these larger national studies are finding is that a lot of queer identified spaces on campuses have been, I'm going to say this and then I'm going to qualify it too,
Mhm.
but have been not only very pro-Palestinian, but also having some what was perceived as explicitly anti-Semitic um, statements as part of, that was connected to that. And we
Mhm.
can talk a little bit more too, if you want, like some of that
Sure.
relationship there, because that's a big topic, and we can talk some there. But so what these students were finding was that because of what they were seeing and hearing, that they didn't feel comfortable, even again in those spaces, saying they were Jewish. And
Mhm.
when they did, getting pushback from
Right.
students. And again, it ties back into the first finding, really, that the other people were considering their identity to be a political statement. And one of the students who shared this, again, was a student who said, I don't, I'm still learning. I'm
Mhm.
still trying to make sense of all of this. And, I have some questions about, my own critiques, right? The student saying of Israeli politics.
Mhm.
And so they didn't feel comfortable that they could be in these spaces. But then, even if coming into Jewish spaces, some of which talks about being more inclusive of all identities, there was even a sense of not, though, fully understanding just how difficult it was for them in some of the queer identified spaces. And so, even not feeling like they were able to bring their whole self there as well. Um, and so again, there's this just kind of this intersectional division, that
Right.
was happening. Um, Also connected, some of the students were feeling a division because as a marginalized group, a number of the students already felt connected in different, like they were associating their friends were other students with different um,
Mhm.
minoritized, marginalized identities. And there was a real feeling of silence from folks who they had, who, have been friends, who they consider themselves to be allies toward. Now, of course, allyship is, can be performative. Allyship is something we're all learning, but there was a sense of, I was there for you. You're not, I'm not, that's not being reciprocated.
Mhm.
Just silence, so much silence, right? Around what is it, what it must be like for them as a Jewish student. And so again, this was causing, this fracturing, this division in people, not only in being able to bring their whole self into any space, but in terms of also just feel, friendship groups. Uh,
Mhm.
and a lot of this was fueled by social media. Uh,
Mhm.
and so there was, yeah, they were, a number of folks talked about how surprised they were to see what some folks were posting on social media. And yeah, and also just, silence. And so that's one of the ways, but, or a few of the ways that they're feeling this division, but also, connected isolation. Some Jewish students just didn't feel safe
Mhm.
going into Jewish spaces. They were scared of violence, assaults, vandalism. They just didn't feel safe. And some students felt safe, but some of the students who are really question, even questioning Israel's politics, critical of Israel's politics, didn't feel like they really had a home in some Jewish spaces because, anti-Semitism had really ramped up, the conversations that were being had, and they didn't know that that would even be an okay space for them.
Mhm.
Whether that was perception or reality, that was how the students were feeling. And, it was really telling when I had, heartbreaking, I should say, when, one of the participants said to me that, it was the first year that they didn't celebrate Passover, which is a significant Jewish holiday, because they didn't feel like they had a space to do it, because they didn't feel either physically safe or they didn't want their holiday dominated, by political conversations. And this was a student who really was questioning, critiquing some of, Israel's politics.
Mhm.
And and so again, that didn't feel like the way they wanted a holiday to look for them. And so they were isolated, they were alone. And so, there's these, so they were living in this real, place of tension between what they wanted their Jewish identity to be internally,
Mhm.
what they were experiencing externally, but some of them still, they brought hope. They brought critical hope. They were still looking for that joy, right? And a number of them really some of them really were affiliating more with other, Jewish students because that did give them the hope and the strength, and but they always had the but, as I said, the what if that was always lingering for them. Um, and so, yeah, so Jewish identity has been this, yeah, very externally imposed sense from others of what it means to be Jewish that was causing some Jewish students, yeah, not to be able to, yeah, bring their whole selves into spaces, celebrate they want to celebrate, be who they want to be. And for me, I step back from all of this, right, as an educator
Mhm.
and, realized again that, college is a time of self-discovery. And so when you've got such competing forces coming at you of who you want to be, how others are defining you, right? We talk about this a lot in student development theory,
Right.
but in this, in this in this context, it was so politicized, and
Mhm.
and it felt so, you know, physically threatening for some, and yeah, that it's been a exhausting place for many to be.
Mhm.
And I'll say the one thing I really, again, I feel like I would be really remiss if we don't talk about some is just how complicated labels have become and
Mm.
categories. Because as I said initially, Jewish identity externally was being seen as a political statement,
Right.
and that was rooted in these binary ways of thinking that as students were trying to make sense of this experience, right? Some did say, you know, I have a connection to Israel, right? I said a number of them did.
Mhm.
I believe in a Jewish right to a homeland in Israel. I may or may not use the label of Zionism, right? Often when things get politically charged, it's easy to just put labels on
Right.
people and assume they have certain meanings. Um, but the reality is they're saying, but I still, you know, and even if I do identify as a Zionist, they could still critique Israel policies, they could still they could still feel very sympathetic, right, toward innocent Palestinians who've been killed. They could still want hope, right? Hope for a peaceful two-state solution, right, where Palestinians also have a homeland, just as they want Jewish people to have a homeland. And so there was this sense of I want to be able to have an identity that is nuanced, right? And when the word Zionism was being used, when they were hearing it, when they were seeing it on social media, again, especially really on social media so much, um, there was this sense that it had one fixed meaning,
Right.
and that it was a meaning that was, really vilified Jewish people. And the and so that again became very difficult for students to even know how to express their Jewish identity. Again, that's what contributed to some of this intersectional division. It's when they go to other places and hear these words being used in really troubling ways. And that's when a couple points, like, again, I come at this as an educator. I come at this thing that it's not only Jewish college students who are coming to understand what their identities are, it's also, it's all of our students.
Right.
It's all of our students who are, part of, again, a very politically charged, emotionally fraught time, who are learning. And oftentimes we do rely on labels, right, as we're learning. And that's part of the reason I think it's just so important to educate, right? Educate folks, have conversation. What do you really mean when you use particular words? And
Right.
that's what our students were saying, like in terms of some of the support they're asking for is they want more education, they want more conversation. What does it mean when you use a label? And again, I always think with any system of oppression, right? We're socialized into certain understandings. As Beverly Daniel Tatum says, right? It's racism's the air in which we breathe, right? And it's the same thing with anti-Semitism. So part of the reason I think it's so important to even think about these anti-Semitic tropes is because we're socialized, to believe some of them without even recognizing that we are, because they're so pervasive.
Right.
And so, I think it's worth, asking that when you use the language of Zionism, are you using that as a substitute for Jewish? Not because that, your intent is to be hateful, but because we bring implicit bias based on what we've been socialized, we've been socialized. And so again, it's a place of education and reflection and looking at who we are. And the students I've been talking with are longing for more nuance. They're so that their identities aren't being their Jewish identities not being put, into this one just, whole that with labels that mean, yeah, that with, labels that come with one definition.
Well, and beyond that, that I think that there has to be some degree of, you mentioned social media several times,
Mhm.
of reposting
Yeah.
um, um, a statement, a post that you found, and there's parts of it you agree with, but I haven't really stopped to think about what all the words mean. I'm
Mhm.
not so sure that's the way I would say it, except that, we're so used to reposting. And what effect does that repost have on someone? And because we don't have a lot of education, we could look at the United States social studies and history. We don't even teach history anymore in the K-12. We teach social studies, right? I
Mhm.
know that we haven't spent a whole lot of time educating folks on what is going on in Israel and Gaza. And to talk about that requires an understanding historical context. No, we can all look at something and saying anybody that's being killed, I don't know what innocent means anymore, but anyone that's being bombed and murdered indiscriminately is just wrong. We can say that across the board with no
Mhm.
hesitancy. But the issue is, how do we talk about it in real terms?
Yeah.
Like what's happening. And I'm not so sure that unless you've studied it, unless you've really listened, that you have enough information to discuss it. And so reposting, that's never been a criteria that we study
Right.
before we repost, right? And the effect that that action has on others. And so it's not only about the nuance, it's nuance, and let's make sure you're saying what you even want to say.
Absolutely.
Because do you know enough about that?
Absolutely.
So I'm hearing a lot about, the harm, the the oi, as well as the joy that they're experiencing. And I really want to like put it in a context now for student affairs educators.
Mhm.
How can we respond in a way that can support Jewish students? Um, what do they need from us?
Yeah.
Um, and what resources are available to learn more? What are the kinds of programs and projects and other things that we can offer for our students?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was the last question, of course, asked the research, the participants, right? Is how can we support you? Again, without you having to have all the answers, but what would
Right.
what would you like to see? Consistently, it was student affairs folks need to educate themselves, right? That was the first one, is educate. They really, again, yeah, a lot of folks just don't yet understand who Jewish students are and don't yet understand some of these really loaded terms,
Mhm.
that are being used, and just it's fueling some fire intentionally or unintentionally, right? So educate ourselves. Students talked about, right, just listening and showing up.
Mhm.
Showing up was showing up at the joyful Jewish events, right? That's part of education.
Right.
You know, folks, students want student affairs professionals to understand, yeah, that a lot of the culture and the cultural part, the joy that Judaism isn't defined through anti-Semitism, right? That there's there's another really good book by Dara Horn called People Love Dead Jews. It's a great provocative title, right? But it means that, isn't it? It's a great title. But it is that oftentimes people get more intrigued by anti-Semitism, by the Holocaust. She asked this really provocative question too. Would people be as interested in Anne Frank had she survived, right? Or is there something really compelling about this young girl who died, right?
Mhm.
And so it's this understanding that we see that people can study the trauma that has occurred, but we want people to be just as interested in the living, joyous side of what it means to be Jewish. And that's what these students were saying is show up, come to Sabbath dinner, come show up at different, for different holidays, and just see what it also means to be Jewish. Um, they were also, it's also talking about being proactive, not just reactive,
Mhm.
for relationships with Jewish students, not just, when something difficult is happening on campus, form these, but and then that connects right with show up, talk, educate, right? But that was also something I think all of us need to do. Um, I think all, I also think the more we can advocate for Jewish identity being part of DEI initiatives, to the extent DEI initiatives are, right. That's a whole
Still
nother,
allowed to exist.
exactly, exactly, whole nother ball of wax. Um, and, but again, this comes to Jewish identity. Again, I think it's connected with it being more of a culture and an ethnicity. And but what would that look like if Jewish identity were represented more in different multicultural spaces? Again, it comes down to a feeling of support and recognition that again, that anti-Semitism is one of the systems of oppression that is shaping college students. Um, there are a number of resources, out there. Again, different, books we can read, right? But we don't always have time to read full books. There's a number of different, just even just websites like the American Jewish Committee puts out a toolkit in terms of here's some things administrators can be doing. I mean, I mean, because of the extent of anti-Semitism over the past year, there's a lot of different organizations that have been putting out a lot of suggestions, ideas, and again, it's educating ourselves and tapping into some of these different resources to help us do that.
Yeah.
And I think, and a lot of this comes down again to also just what we talked about earlier, recognizing that Jewish students are not a monolith, right? And the way to support students is going to look very differently. It's going to look different depending again on, even what their religious practice looks like, the extent to which they identify. And I should also say, in terms of what folks' relationships are, perspectives are in terms of the Israel-Hamas war, is right. Because even among the 13 students I talked to, right, there was a lot of diversity there, right? Whether folks were very supportive of Israel, maybe in some uncritical ways, because Jewish students can do that too, right? It's not just non-Jewish students who are falling into different binaries, but um, but then a lot, folks who are, pro-Israel for, very, because of very, thoughtful, deep, reflective ways they have done this. Students who are questioning, students who are critiquing. And, I talked to, one particular student who would identify as anti-Zionist, right? That is not the larger majority of Jewish college students. But again, that is part of the Jewish college student experience. And again, that looks different at different campuses, the extent to which you have students who are organizing, around that particular perspective. And so again, just understanding the diversity among Jewish college students by spending time with them in proactive ways. And there's lots of different professional development out there, and take some time to doing some of this learning.
Well, I'm thinking about that too, because I think the thing that I heard earlier is you said something about the silence and how essentially my words, but the silence was deafening. It was so loud, the
Yeah.
silence was that it's in a place. And so the question that I always ask myself in those situations when who is a student who feel automatically comfortable coming to me? Who are those students? And I find them. And then when I think about the groups where I don't think these students would automatically come to me if they wanted to share their concern, I've got to figure out ways of making myself open to them. So the question, I guess, for student affairs practitioners might be, would Jewish students
Question.
who are struggling on campus feel that your office, your space is a place that they could come to talk about that? And if it's not, what are the steps we need to make sure that they can? And so I think that that was just one more to add to your list.
No, that's so important because, because I can even say as a 50 something year old, professor, the silence, even for me, was
Yep.
really hard. It
Yep.
was, it was really hard. And there were times when, I wasn't sure where I felt comfortable. Now again, but, with a lot more, age and experience, I could navigate that
Right.
fine. And I had enough folks in my life, right, who were right there as a support. But for a college student, yeah, that silence just who are college students in this again process of understanding themselves.
Mhm.
That silence was frightening for some of them. And so what your point is so important. And first year college students, right, came to college and within, still just trying to find any community. A month or so later, just face yeah, we're in the middle of this, really difficult time, and knowing that there's someone they can go to,
Right,
really important, and not just in affiliate with particular Jewish student organizations or
right,
whatnot, but campus wide. Is this a home for me? Do I belong here?
right. Because all of our students are asking that question, and all of our students who feel marginalized in some way are going to experience that. And right now, in the midst of this,
Mhm.
they're certainly asking those questions. We could keep talking about this for days. Actually,
Yeah.
Liz, I could just sit here and listen to you for days because I'm thinking, God, her students must just really sit there and soak it all up. But we're running out of time.
Yeah.
To ask you, is there a question that you wish we could have covered, but we didn't get to? I'm not saying we can get to it now, but the other questions that need to be asked,
Yeah.
responded.
Um, I don't know that there's a particular question, but there is, something that I've been thinking about a lot is just the time right now, what this is we're heading into the high holiday
Mm-hmm.
time in Jewish religion, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. These are, the most significant reflective times. And this year, because of when the Jewish holidays fall, because they're on a different calendar, lunar calendars, they fall different times each year. Um, they're falling right within the week of October 7th.
Right.
And so this, I think it's just really important for us to think about for some students, many Jewish students, what a difficult time this is. Um, it's both, but again, it's it's a difficult time, and Jewish students again are used to living in with multiple truths.
Mm-hmm.
And it's both a joyous time, right? It's a celebration, it's a joyous time, it's a time to come together. And it's a time that spurs a lot of deep reflection, and it's deep reflection on what's been a really challenging year.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's important to note what's, what this period of time could be like for many Jewish students, and how do we show support? And that reminds me, when I had mentioned, like when we were talking about support, you know, showing up can be pretty simple. One of my participants just talked about a professor who would just send a quick email saying, Happy New Year, or, Happy Passover, and what an impact that had on the student. It's like, he said, oh, with like surprise, he really cared, and it was just this simple. And so even just how can we as student affairs professionals just show we're
Mm-hmm.
aware that this is a hard time, and um and a joyous time. And yeah, and so I think that's also just something I want to make sure that I'm noting what's this time period is also
Right.
like.
It doesn't have to be big
Yeah,
interventions. It can be something as simple as recognizing what day it is, what point in the year it is. So
exactly. So
Elisa, I am so grateful for all of your time today. I have to tell you, I loved this opportunity to sit and talk with you. And as we prepared for this, I find you so deeply thoughtful, and I love all of your backing up to context all the time. My students tell me I do that all the time. So I spend 40 minutes on context and 10 minutes on the
exactly.
this was
Um,
really a gift for me personally, and our listeners. So
well, it's mutual. Like I said at the beginning, I am so grateful for you being a conversation partner and so inviting. And yeah, it's your support and your own curiosity and insights, and for keeping me on track, are just really, I'm really grateful. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. We can continue this love fest, but let me say, I think, a couple of things for our sponsors. So I want to again thank Elisa. I also want to give a shout out to the great work of our producer, Nat Ambrosi. She's going to help us make us look and sound so good. And that's going to be a real task for her today, since I keep stumbling over every other word. Hey, if you're listening today and you're not already receiving our weekly newsletter, please visit our website at studentaffairsnow.com and scroll to the bottom of the homepage to add your email to our MailChimp list. While you're there, check out our archives. Thanks to our sponsors of today's episode. Routledge, Taylor & Francis is the leading academic publisher in education, publishing a wide range of books, journals, and other resources for practitioners, faculty, administrators, and researchers. They have welcomed Stylus Publishing to their publishing program and are thrilled to enrich their offerings in higher education, student affairs, professional development, assessment, and more. Routledge is proud to support Student Affairs Now. View their complete catalog of authoritative education titles at routledge.com/education. Huron is our other sponsor today. Huron is a global professional services firm that collaborates with clients to put possible into practice by creating sound strategies, optimizing operations, accelerating digital transformation, and empowering businesses and their people to their own future. By embracing diverse perspectives, encouraging new ideas, and challenging the status quo, Huron creates sustainable results for the organizations they serve. Please take a moment to visit the Student Affairs Now website and click on the sponsors link to learn more. Again, I'm Rochelle Pope. Thanks again to Elisa Abes
Got it.
today, and to everyone who is watching or listening. Friends, let's be kind and spread some joy.